There is definitely there is something very addictive about it. I mean, if you think about comedy, stand-up comedy in particular, it's an insane thing to do. It's nuts to go out and stand in front of a group full of strangers, and you have one aim, and that is to make them laugh. It's nuts. But there's a reason people do it, because doing it is it kicks off something. It's a dopamine explosion or something. There's something very powerful about it.
Hey, kia ora team. Today's episode is brought to you by Mr. Vintage. Mr. Vintage is New Zealand's most iconic t-shirt brand. Doesn't matter if it's a local pop cultural phenomenon, a sporting event, or even a New Zealand personality, there's every chance that Mr. Vintage has made a t-shirt for them and some product for it. Kiwi owned since 2004, selling Kiwiana t-shirts and gifts online. There's even a range of king sizes for us bigger fellas. Today, Mr. Vintage and us want to give you an extra special. How about 20% off any men's t-shirt? All you need to do is go to mrvintage.co.nz. In the checkout, use the promo code FUNNY, FUNNY, and you will get 20% off any men's t-shirt. Head to mrvintage.co.nz, enter the promo code FUNNY at checkout for 20% off any men's t-shirt. And welcome to the show, Mr. Jeremy Elwood. Jeremy, thank you for joining us. So very nice to have you on Let's Talk Funny.
Yeah, let's do that.
Hey, how's the day going? What have you been up to today? Anything exciting happening in your world at the moment?
Oh, look, it's summer, which traditionally is comedy's kind of off season, with a few exceptions. But yeah, summer, I mean, and this goes back 20 years and more, 20 years of my experience. It's when the bands take over the music festivals. Right. So I'm still, I did a weekend at the comedy club here in Auckland, but basically I'm still on holiday for another week or two.
I noticed though, there's a lot of international comedians coming through New Zealand. Like this sort of month, there's some big names coming. So obviously, I don't know whether it means it's their off season in the US as well, but it seems to be, maybe it's just got summer in the Southern Hemisphere. They do Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, well, it's their winter, exactly. Yeah, and so a lot of that will just be personal choice. They want to come down here and enjoy a summer break, because a lot of the names who are coming here, it doesn't matter what time of the year they tour, they'll sell tickets. But yeah, it is people. It's also we're not far away from the beginning of particularly the Australian kind of festival season. Right. Adelaide Fringe kind of kicks that off. Then you got Melbourne Comedy Festival. Perth is in there somewhere. And I mean, that's why the New Zealand Comedy Festival happens when it is, because it kind of tacks onto the tail end of that. So there's a bit of a circuit down this way.
Right, that makes sense. So the American, UK artists, they go to Australia where the bigger audiences are and they tag New Zealand on after it, sort of thing.
Yeah, kind of. And then it's sort of, I mean, that whole festival circuit is still basically aimed at getting people ready for Edinburgh in August.
It's funny, it's such a different world this day and age. Like I wanted to talk about obviously this podcast for people who haven't seen this before, which is anyone, is really about comedy. I do other long form conversations, but I think you've been on the other one maybe twice, Jeremy. But what I enjoy most of all is speaking to comedians. One, because I have a good relationship with a lot of them through my work, but two is that comedians are. Like, I remember the story that Al Gore said to Jon Stewart when Jon Stewart's sitting in a studio and he's talking about telling the news of the day. And he's basically going, why are we the only ones saying this? Why are we the only people like the Daily Show who was actually putting this out there? And Al Gore said, it was the only one that could tell the truth to the king was the jester.
Yeah.
It was the only person who could speak truth without fear of getting their head cut off. And when Al Gore said that, probably 12, 15 years ago when I was watching The Daily Show, I was like, puts comedians in a very different light. Social commentary, education, a good laugh. I don't know, I love it so much. I've never done it. I've worked on stage and comedy sort of settings, but I've never done stand-up comedy, but I'm drawn to it, man. A new comedy show comes out on Netflix, I watch it. A new tour comes through, I try and get to it. It's just one of those things. I'm a mega fan. I'm fanboying at the moment. Is that the right thing? Something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's changed a lot. I think it feels to me like comedy's changed a lot from the outside looking in, thanks to places like Netflix. I mean, to get a special that used to get on Comedy Central or on HBO was a massive thing. And I'm not putting down specials on Netflix, but it feels like to get a special now is much easier. But it's also much better because it gives exposure to the field a lot more, and then we get to enjoy more comedy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would say it's just the industry's just expanded. I mean, it's a lot bigger. It's where there are more outlets, like you say. With it did used to be. I mean, HBO. I mean, that was a huge part of the innovation that HBO brought to television. Television, full stop. But specifically for stand-up, was you would actually have televised specials, and that just didn't happen before. I mean, you might get a spot on a variety show or something like that, but to have people doing an hour plus, HBO really broke new ground when they did that. It was people used to just do albums, audio albums.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, people still do. I mean, not so much here in this part of the world, but I was in Canada recently, and people are still recording audio albums because digital radio's a really big thing. So yeah, it has expanded, and like you say, it does mean, when there's more stuff out there, it's kind of like the music industry. The more stuff that gets released, the more stuff, and comedy's so subjective, but I agree with you. I think there's a lot of really hit and miss stuff out there. But at the same time, it's not the same 5 or 6 people putting out albums every couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with the proliferation of specials. It's like, and look, it's not a skill I have, so saying this makes it sound like I'm criticizing something I can't do, but it's, if you've got now 100 specials, of which 50 are crap, you get 50 amazing specials from good to amazing. Whereas in the past, if you got 5 amazing specials, you know what I mean? It's like, so even
it's
though
economy of scale.
Yeah, completely. I like it when you put things much smarter than me, Jeremy. I'm interested in your system around how you do this as well, because I've witnessed you coming up with a joke, right? So for people who don't know, which is everybody, we used to do a podcast together, and we would talk comedy. We would talk politics in a lighthearted way, and we would talk about what we're going to talk. And I've watched you go, and then you'd go, okay, let's go. And I'd throw it to you, and you'd come up that you'd have it. You seem to be quite precise in your style. Like I can see people kind of going on stage and just going crazy until they find something. You seem quite precise. Like the small amount that I've seen you in that creative moment, you seem to be like, okay, A plus B equals C. That can relate back to A, and then, yep, that works. Okay, let's do it. Would that be a fair assertion how you make all of your comedy? Are you quite a precise, let's work this out kind of guy?
Yeah, to a point. I think I love your description, by the way, of how I write too. I'm going to just use that next time somebody asks. I'm very much a guy. Yeah, I think I'm certainly precise when I for a starting point. I'll have often no more than what you've just described. I'll have one line in my head. I'll often come up with a punchline before I come up with anything that leads into it. And what leads into it, or sometimes I'll come up with the first line, the concept, and what comes out of it, that will develop a lot on stage. I mean, I would say 80% of my writing actually on stage in front of people.
Right, cool.
Because that's just the way I work. I'm not one of these. I can't sit at home. I know comedians who will set aside, an hour or more each day, and they will just sit and write, and that's what they do, and they do that every day. And all power to them. I just can't do that. I don't have the patience for it. But you're right in terms of I'm normally going in with quite a specific idea of what the joke's going to be about. And often what the punchline to it is. I'm not as specific as some people. I mean, I know people who will agonize over a word for days. I don't get that specific, but my for want of a better word, I really don't like using this word, but my target, the thing that I'm aiming the joke at is usually pretty well defined and pretty quickly defined.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. So do you like see the punchline and you figure out how to get there, or do you find the premise and then go, where is this going? Or is it a bit of both?
Bit of both. Yeah. And usually separately. It's either or, it's if I've come up with the premise and the punchline, I'm done. Basically, that's the routine. But yeah, quite often I will come up with a punchline and go, that's the joke I'm trying to get to, but how do I get there? And I guess probably more common for me is I'll have the concept. I'll have the thing I want to. I mean, most of my writing comes from things that annoy me, things that make me angry. Yeah, I mean, simple as that. I mean, I've been called a political comic. I think that's a bit overarching. I think I just write about stuff that pisses me off. And so, yeah, if I have a concept, and often, sometimes that'll take years to get from concept to actually a piece on stage. And sometimes it'll take 2 minutes. It depends on how my brain's working that day.
So it's a bit like, I mean, you hear musicians and you hear like, that amazing song that they won a Grammy for, they came up with in 90 seconds on the toilet and it just went. It's the same. It's a creative process, and both, either painstakingly working on something for years or getting it in 90 seconds, both work sometimes, both have validity.
Well, funnily enough, I mean, I always say that the best piece of writing advice I ever read, in terms of, and I apply this to my comedy all the time, but it came from one of the Finn brothers. I'm pretty sure it was Neil. I don't want to get that wrong, but it was in an article, and they asked about his writing process, and he just went, make sure you write it all down. Write the whole thing. If you sit down and you write 36 verses for a song, you can always take them out. Whereas if you write the first verse and then leave it, walk away and go, oh, the rest will come to me, those are the ones that take years. Those are the ones that you never quite pick up where you've left off. And that's what I do. That's what I try and do with comedy. If I'm writing about a concept, I'll write pages of it, and maybe 2 lines of that will actually make it into the final routine.
Right.
Whereas the ones that take years are the ones where I've kind of had an idea and I've left it alone and I've thought about it, and I'll sort of come back to it when I get around to it. It'll get there eventually. But yeah, writing it all down, overwriting is the key in some ways.
I like how you said, one of the Finn brothers said, write it all down and the rest will come to me, because that kind of sounds like a Finn brothers song. It sounds like a lyric from the Finn brothers. Write it all down, the rest will come to me.
And it's funny. I mean, if you listen to, a lot of songs, you kind of think, yeah, I bet those weren't the original first, 6 verses. I mean, I'm sure there are songs that have come, the ones that people claim they came in a dream, they came fully formed. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I actually believe that happens, because I've had bits of comedy that do that. But I think it's more common where, a song like, I don't know, pick a song, it probably had 25 verses and they've picked the best 5, and I think comedy, for me at least, is very much like that.
It's like, always take the weather without you, always take the weather alongside you, always take the weather with you. Let's go with that one. That kind of works. It kind of works. So you say you write everything down. Are you someone who gets on stage and riffs and records? Like, do you record all your sessions that you're doing when you're live on stage?
I record very little, which is one of the reasons that I don't have an awful lot of presence online. I don't have much that you can go to YouTube or whatever and find. I hate watching myself back. I'm still for those of you, does anyone know that feeling of when you've first ever heard your voice recorded?
Oh yes. Preaching to the choir. Preaching to the choir.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, Jesus, do I sound like that? I hate watching video of myself. So I don't record, but I riff. Absolutely, yeah. And when I say write everything down, I don't actually mean that physically necessarily. I have whole pieces that have only ever existed in my head and in my memory. And then, which means that, Ben Hurley, for example, Ben's an encyclopedia on people. He has an incredible memory for people's material that they've done in the past.
All right.
And he will mention bits to me that I have no recollection of doing. And then he'll describe them to me and I'll go, oh yeah, that was actually quite good, but I never wrote it down. So I'm actually trying these days to be a bit more careful and actually physically writing it down so that it doesn't just get thrown away.
It is. Jokes can stick though, can't they? Like, I know that sometimes, like, I can remember jokes from specific people. I can remember a Jeremy Corbett joke about losing weight, but much like an insurance claim, when he then got the weight back, he claimed more than he actually lost in the first place, like you would when you have your car stolen. I can remember a Rabin Khan joke about, people telling him to go home and he didn't want to go back to Masterton. I can remember all these jokes that go through. It's a bit like I can remember playing golf, and I can actually remember a particular 5-iron that I hit. It's weird how those things stick. But yeah, it's funny because I wonder, do you ever think how much have I left on the stage whilst riffing because I didn't record it or leave it down? Have I left some of that gold up there but you still haven't changed your habits and started recording yourself every night?
Yeah, 100%. Oh, I'm sure and also I'm a bit of a perfectionist. So, without any sense of arrogance at all, I think I can honestly say I've thrown away more material than most comedians working in New Zealand have ever written. And I mean that with no arrogance at all whatsoever. I've been not so much in recent years. COVID really took a hit on my productivity.
Right. Wow.
Not because of any illness, just for different reasons. But in the past, I did 12, I think, solo hours in a row, 12 years in a row with an entirely new hour every year for a comedy festival.
But then, but you haven't recorded those. That makes no sense. If you've got 12-hour shows, why don't you have, I don't even mean you have to sign up with, I don't know, BMG or Sony for an album, but this day and age, there's Spotify. They could be on 12 individual hours and you don't have any of them.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Wow. No, it's something I should really fix. But I guess, another huge thing of that is, when I started, it wasn't that, not to play the back in my day card, but when I started actually recording stuff wasn't as easy. I was particularly recording it to a good quality.
I remember the 1970s as well, Jeremy. Yep.
Yeah, well, mine was the early 90s, lugging a 4-track around and things like that, when I was doing music. And I guess I just sort of got into that headspace and never moved. Yeah, I am behind the times on that. I'm very happy to admit that.
I think it might be Joe Rogan. We're talking comedy in this podcast, so I love him or hate him for his politics or whatever, but I think I've heard him say that he records every set and then he listens back to it sometimes the same night that he's done it. There seems to be a real culture in America, though. Maybe it's because there's so many comedy clubs that the guys turn up when they're trying new stuff out at 1 a.m. and that's what they do. And then they listen back to it. Obviously, again, economies of scale, we don't have that in New Zealand, but when you're on stage in New Zealand, how much of it is, this is my jam, and how much of it is, I'm playing now to find something?
I think there is also there's a difference that's worth pointing out with people, people at that level in the US who are spending a whole year writing for their next special.
Yeah.
I remember, speaking of, controversial comedians, but I remember Louis C.K. saying that in an interview once. I think it was David Letterman asked him about how he felt being called the funniest man in America. And his line was something along the lines of, I am the night that I record my special. But the other 364 days of the year, I'm one of the worst comedians in the country, in the world. And I think, particularly for those people, when you're at that level, it's almost impossible for them. They can't go do a little anonymous 10-minute spot at a comedy club somewhere. I can see why they would be recording constantly, because you're trying to find the stuff that is actually going to hold up, that isn't just responding to, that isn't crowd work. You are trying to find, the material that you can put that is going to be recorded for posterity at a certain point. It
must also be hard. It must be hard when you have those massive audiences and massive reach to not turn up somewhere and just have an ecosystem of your fans.
Yeah,
because there's obviously a difference between good comedy, anything, good art, and art that your supporters already like and want more of. And I think for me, I'm a fan of Dave Chappelle's work, but I think in his last 2 specials, it feels like more echo chamber comedy to me. Whereas those first kind of 2 or 3 put on Netflix after coming back feel different. And I don't know, there's no criticism of the man. He's said by many to be the best ever, or certainly the best current comedian in the world. Whether people agree with that or not, I don't know. But it feels to me that potentially his last 2 specials have been more echo chambery. I'll bring Elon Musk on stage when I'm doing a stand-up, because this is the people I talk to, not realizing that there's a bunch of Silicon Valley people in the audience in San Francisco who kind of thought it wasn't the best thing for him to do. Yeah. The echo chamber seems to be a concern, I think. I remember Ricky Gervais talking about, someone asked him, would you ever take a knighthood? I actually spoke to your wife about this, and congratulations for having an honorable wife, by the way, who said, you kind of always have to be a bit on the outside. Maybe you become a bit more industry if you take that sort of knighthood sort of thing. And he was like, really not for me. I think that also comes with success. If you don't have to grind for the next special to be successful, because, you've got 60 million from the first 3, and now you're surrounded by people in that kind of life, that to me feels like it could be something that squashes creativity and squashes art on some level.
Yeah, there is a bit of that. I mean, there's the old comparison too, which is, I mean, comedy is kind of unique in that, people used to say, comedy's the new rock and roll, except the difference is that, I can't go out and I don't have an entire audience waiting for me to finish with whatever my comedic version of satisfaction is,
Yeah.
You can't just
the
go out
machine
and
story with Bert Kreischer.
Yeah, you can't just keep going out and playing the hits,
Yeah.
There's a massive expectation from people that every time they see you, not me specifically, but for those bigger acts, Chris Rock, for example, can't release the same special over and over again.
Yeah.
Whereas, how many live recordings are there of the Rolling Stones, playing basically the same set, and people will still go, they'll go see their favorite band, expecting, and they'll be disappointed if they don't hear the hits.
Yeah.
I
think I've heard Jay Leno speak to this a bit as well, because I've heard podcasts with comedians talking about why Jay Leno hasn't really done specials, and then they tell a story about one of them talking to Jay Leno about it, like privately, and he basically says, well, if I do a special, what am I going to tour with? Yeah, because he can go around America, maybe not so much now, but when he was a young comedian, for 2, 3, 4 years with exactly the same show. As soon as you put it onto something, then that's burnt and you got to move forward. And on one level, I kind of go, haha, good business model. On another level, I go, oh, creativity. Is that really how you want to just roll? Like playing that's one of the things I used to love improv theater. I always used to struggle with doing a show, because doing the same stuff every single night, I found it boring. Whereas, where you and I met with Theatre Sports Auckland, it's like doing different things every single night is what floated my boat. So I can see both sides.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like about stand-up is the fact that you don't, things last more than the night that they happen, because I did come from an improv background, and I do love that spark of creativity. But I mean, one of the beautiful things about putting a stand-up piece together is exactly what we talked about earlier, which is, it will start with one line, it'll start with one joke, but by the end of it, it'll be a 15-minute piece that's evolved. And it's pulled in bits from all over the place, and it lasts a little bit longer. But I mean, there is that weird difference between stand-up and almost anything else, which is that that inherent kind of push to constantly be creating new stuff all the time, which is it can be a real double-edged sword.
I'm sure you've seen it. There's it might be HBO actually, a bunch of comedians sitting around a table. Ricky Gervais is one of them, Chris Rock is one of them, Louis C.K. is one of them, Jerry Seinfeld's one of them. There's one more I can't remember right now. And they talk about the idea of the Rolling Stones thing. And it might have been Jerry Seinfeld. One of them says what they do is a new set, and then their encore material is the stuff that people want to hear, the stuff that they shout out. Like Andy Kaufman used to constantly get Lotka shouted at him, and he hated it. But like Bert Kreischer is a perfect example. I'm not sure how much of a fan of his you are or not. I like him and Tom Segura's podcast very, very much. But one of his stand-up specials was the Machine Story. The next stand-up special, he did the stand-up special, and then his encore, he came out and he started the Machine Story again, which he tells word for word, and that was as the special faded out. So like he was saying that, if you come, you'll hear the story, and here it is at the end. You didn't hear it again in the second special. That was how it then kind of went to music and faded out for the audience at home. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I've always wondered, I might have talked to you about this actually, the idea of a performer versus a comedian, because you can get a cover band. I've always wondered how it would be having a performer like overtly performing other people's stand-up, like on stage and having a sign behind them that says Louis C.K. and then doing a Louis C.K. joke, having a Jeremy Elwood and then doing a Jeremy Elwood joke. So they're actually a cover band, but for comedians. I've always wondered like how that would be accepted and received if it was all the biggest sets, like the 10 biggest jokes ever told, someone covering them.
Yeah, I think I've only seen it done deliberately a couple of times, sort of on almost kind of roast battle. Yeah, I've seen it done, deliberately, but they don't own up to being covers. I've seen people do, other people's sets word for word, but that's not particularly acceptable.
Yeah,
we don't have many rules, but not doing someone else's material is right.
How would the industry handle that if there was like a fringe festival performer who did that, and like above board, like I said, identified who's
Oh, you
juxtaposing
mean you mean actually did it as a covers thing?
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think the industry would handle that? Like the comedians industry, the comedy industry?
I think the industry would be fine with it. It'd be sort of interesting to see how audiences handled it. Because I think, I mean, part of it is, I mean, there's so much more that goes on with a particular stand-ups. It's not, you know, writing is a huge part of it for me. I think it's the most important part of it, but there's so much else that goes on, you know. There's their personality, the way they deliver. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Yeah, I don't think the industry, I mean, as long as it was sort of absolutely billed as what it was. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you'd start getting into the idea of having to pay for rights and stuff like that. I mean, we're not covered by a, you know, sort of performance rights in the same way that songwriters are. So I'm sure you'd get a few people getting sniffy about that. But
yeah, no, that's interesting. But the other thing you'd have to be aware of is that what if they did it better? Like you compare it to the music. Like think Johnny Cash versus 9 Inch Nails. I think most people acknowledge the Johnny, including 9 Inch Nails, that the Johnny Cash version is better. So that would be the other thing is you'd lose a lot because you did. But imagine if someone came out and they performed.
I'd love to see it if someone just doing someone's, you know, completely inappropriate, you know, like a, you know, a 5 foot white woman doing Chris Rock's material from his Bigger and Blacker album. You know, that'd be great. I'd watch that.
Comedy in New Zealand, how is it at the moment? Like, I'd like to know a couple of things. Yeah. Like you as a stand-up comedian, it feels like stand-up comedy performing only. I'm not talking about stand-up comedians who also work in radio or who kind of do emceeing and that kind of stuff as well. I'm assuming no one can survive in New Zealand, a New Zealand comedian only doing gigs, like other than corporate gigs that are, you know, emceeing type corporate gigs as well. How is stand-up comedy in New Zealand? And am I wrong in that? Could someone just do the clubs and the pubs and make a living off that if that was their only income?
It depends what you consider making a living, I suppose. Well, you know, there are people who, you know, it's the same with musicians. You know, there are people who that is the way they make their living. I mean, they might not be making a ton of money, and it might not be a lifestyle that appeals to everybody. But yeah, there are people who do that. They just do road gigs and you know, don't have day jobs. But we certainly don't have, you know, I was talking with a friend of mine over the weekend who's back. He's been living in the UK for the last 6 years. And I mean, the UK has an enormous touring circuit. And there are hundreds of people who just make their living just doing that. People who, you know, you wouldn't know their names, you wouldn't recognize them from TV. And the US, you know, those big markets do have that. We don't have that. I mean, we don't have that constant. You'd really you'd be hard pressed simply just to get enough gigs, you know, unless you're doing a tour, unless you're out there creating them yourself. If you were relying on other people's bookings, I mean, there's just no way you'd fill a year with that. And that's nothing new. I mean, it's always been like that in New Zealand, and it's got the main thing to do with that is just simply the size of our population.
Yeah.
You know, when the whole country's got a population smaller than Sydney, I mean, of course there's not 300 gigs that you can do every year. Yeah.
The musician analogy though as well, obviously they've got radio airplay. We don't really have that in the stand-up comedy world. When I say we don't really have that, I mean we as a country, not we as in doing the same job.
I kind of wonder whether we've missed a bit of a trick there. I mean, like I said, I was surprised when I was back in Canada that you know, people were talking. There was a lot of conversation about people recording albums because they were playing them on Sirius and Just for Laughs have their own digital radio station over there. And apparently the royalties and the per play rates are actually very good. I mean, they're far better than something like Spotify. So yeah, I don't know whether I should have just kept it to myself rather than sharing it with you and your audience. But I think maybe that's something we haven't explored enough in this country.
So what I'm hearing you say is, let's have a meeting later. Business opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, comedy producer, new hat. Yep.
The other thing that you know, bands in New Zealand do is you look at people who break the mold, like 660 is the guys at the moment who seem to have done it better than anybody. How one year they played one gig at Western Springs, and I think I was talking to, I can't remember, some old rocker in my podcast, I forget his name right now, and he's like, yeah, they got house buying money at that concert, each of them. And I'm like, they've worked out a pretty good model, has 660, as to how to make the music industry, because they haven't really got international success yet, but within New Zealand actually work. So good on them, yeah.
Yeah, and there are a few New Zealand comedians who are doing that, in not to that, no one's playing arenas. But you look at people, Ursula Carlson's a really good example. She'll tour here, she'll do a tour once a year, and she's playing big theaters. And they can do that in Australia as well. And there are some Australians who do that. Chopper Heath, who comes over, he does that. That's his example. I mean, there's a guy who makes his living almost entirely from touring these days. Not a Kiwi act, but Australian act.
Yeah.
So that mold has been broken a little bit. There's been one or two examples in the past. Mike King used to do big theater tours in his heyday, and but it's become a little more common than it was certainly when I started. So people are doing that a little bit more.
Ursula's done very well in Australia. Obviously, been involved in some panel TV shows and stuff over there. But also, fucking Rose Matafeo. I mean, what do you guys think about what Rose is doing? She was in the Big Fat Quiz this year, just gone, and it's like I did some talk back over summer, and I'm like, what's one of those strange things you enjoy about this time of year? Like, let's not do family, let's not do presents. What is it? And I went, for me, it's Big Fat Quiz. Like the start of December, I start going, oh, end of the year, Big Fat Quiz is going to be up soon, and Rose Matafeo's on it. It's like, do you guys look at that? And is it like how much is the green-eyed monster? How much is nothing but admiration and for what she's doing? But she's got to be New Zealand's currently most successful comedian, surely.
Yeah, well, see, here's the difference between you and I, Pat, is I watch very little comedy on television.
Right.
Or
Okay.
I just don't. It's not what I want to do when I go home. So my understanding of Rose's success is very much second or third hand. I've never seen Starstruck. Is it? I haven't watched these specials. But yeah, I mean, there's somebody who really did, grab the opportunity and run with it. Her path has been, remarkably similar to Flight of the Conchords was 15 years ago. Same kind of thing. You go over, you have success with the live work, you parlay that into radio and then television. I guess the slight difference with Rose is that simply by the benefit of her being a solo act rather than a double act, is she's more suited to go on things like the quiz, panel shows, things like that. So she's got another avenue. But yeah, I mean, those opportunities are out there, and people have been taking them. I think one thing that gets underplayed is people do forget how much of the groundbreaking work, was done not just by people like the Conchords, but prior to that, New Zealand acts, people like Brandon Lovegrove going to the UK and working the circuit there and doing really well. People like Michelle, breaking boundaries all over the place, just breaking that perception of what a New Zealand comedian is. Because we very much, had within our own industry as well as the wider world, had that perception that New Zealand comedy, it's never going to compare to name your overseas country here. But people have just proven that's wrong time and time again. And that gives people, not only does that open doors on an individual level, but it gives people a confidence, again, in the same way that the music scene is. Suddenly, if you're a 16-year-old singer putting pop songs together in your garage or your basement, you can look at Lord and you can just go, this is doable. There's just that it's one more of those little ceilings that's taken away just by somebody else having done it. It's a huge thing, and it often doesn't get maybe as acknowledged as it should.
Speaking of Flight of the Conchords, the thing that was fantastic about them is crossing those two mediums, music and comedy. Because I have friends who in that era were building a musical career in Nashville. And they said when Flight of the Conchords hit in America, everyone in the music industry would see the flag on their, on the guitar case or whatever, and go Flight of the Conchords. Like it was interesting how they weren't just successful commercially, but what they did within the industry is raise New Zealand's things about. And maybe Rose is doing a bit of that now.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that going on. And we're in a kind of unique place where we do actually have a proven track record of success in the arts in general, across the board now. but at the same point, we haven't lost the novelty factor yet.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
we're
so
like
cute.
Canada.
We're from New Zealand. That's so cute. You guys, New Zealand,
Yeah,
so
we're like
cute.
Canada was maybe 40 years ago, you know, when Canadian artists were just starting to break through. But now it's just like, oh, yeah, it's another, you know, Justin Bieber's Canadian, another fucking Canadian.
Nickelback.
Yeah,
Nickelback came and ruined it.
We haven't lost that yet.
Nickelback actually ruined it for Canada. After Nickelback came through, they're like, no, no more of that stuff, please. Get those hockey pucks away from us, please. I want to know as well, speaking of, you know, Canada and stuff, when did you know you were funny? What was the process of you kind of going, people are laughing, I'm funny? How did that work? How did you find out that maybe even before you realized being funny could be a career, one step before that is just realizing you were funny? Tell me that story.
I guess it was a process of elimination, working at all the other things that I wasn't. You know, wasn't any good on the sports field. You know, wasn't particularly good in certain academic areas. I was always drawn to performance. You know, I was always drawn to, right from a very early age, you know, if there was a school play, I was in it. You know, if there was an opportunity for to get on stage as part of a group. I mean, it was just something that side of things, I was always, that came very naturally to me. The humor, the comedy side of it, yeah, I guess that just sort of happened. You know, some of those plays I would get cast in the funny role. I mean, this is somebody else's script, you know, somebody else had written it, but I would get cast in that role. And I had a knack for getting the laughs out of the script, because, you know, simply performing a comedy script isn't as easy as you might think. You know, it's very easy to take even the best written comedy script, and if you have someone who's just doesn't have the ability to get the humor out of it, but I had that ability. So I guess maybe other people, excuse me, other people recognized that in me long before I did, probably.
Was that was that in New Zealand? Was that schooling in New Zealand? When did you actually arrive?
I can remember a very early school production. It must have, I think I was playing Santa Claus, so I'm assuming it was near around Christmas. Who knows? It might have just been a character in something else. When I was at you know, sort of the version of late primary, early intermediate school in the UK when I lived there.
Okay.
I mean, I remember getting laughs at that and getting compliments for getting laughs at that. That's probably the earliest one that I can specifically put a memory on.
Did you get
and
the
then when I
get the
came
tingles?
To
the tingles when you got the laughs, did the tingles come?
Yeah, I guess so.
I like this.
There is definitely there is something very addictive about it. I mean, if you think about comedy, stand-up comedy in particular, it's an insane thing to do. You know, it's nuts to go out and stand in front of a group full of strangers, and you have one aim, and that is to make them laugh. You know, it's nuts, but there's a reason people do it, because doing it is it kicks off something. It's a dopamine explosion or something. There's something very powerful about it. So I think I worked that out at a very early age, and then I was attracted to that. Then I moved to New Zealand and very much kept my head down for a few years. You know, I was the different kid with the funny accent, and the last thing I wanted to do was draw more attention to myself. So I guess that started again with when theater sports came along, and I again found that you know, I found myself in a position where I could actually make the guys in the first 15 laugh. I remember, you know, doing that at school and going, oh, hang on, okay. Because, you know, the school I went to was very much a traditionally boys sports school, and, you know, I've always been crap at sports. So that was my way. That was my way of rising above the herd, I guess, in some ways.
So you saw something in yourself at secondary school, yeah? That was like, oh, this is
that was when I started thinking, okay, there's something a bit different about the way I do this.
Right.
That was where I think I first ever had the idea that this is something I might be. This is something not everyone can do, and I can. You know, I wouldn't go as far as saying this is something I'm better at than other people, because I think it's more general than that. This is something that not. You know, I think it must be finding out you have a natural golf swing or something, you know,
right.
There must be a moment where, like a child prodigy sports person, doing it and being able to do it feels natural to them. And I guess doing it felt natural to me for a long time. There is a moment when you realize that it's not, you know, that it's not, that the reason other people aren't doing it isn't because they can't be bothered or because they've got other better things to do. It's because they can't. So I think, yeah, it would have been at high school that started to sink in for me a little bit.
Did you also have a process there? Like, I silly analogy for you, but I was in my 40s and I can remember sitting in front of the computer and all of a sudden I wasn't looking at the keys.
Right.
Like, I've been typing on a keyboard since I was in my teens, you know, on some
Yeah.
level. Never done any training, but all of a sudden I actually realized, I'm like, holy shit, I remember the moment. I'm like, holy shit, this is now natural to me.
Yeah.
There's a difference between a natural inclination and when something is natural. Is there a moment in your career? Like, I've heard some comedians who tour all the time say kind of the first 3 to 5 years, they're dog shit. That's what they say. And then that second 5 years, they're getting it. After 10 years is like when you've really hit it. Did you come to that point, or have you had that point? Can you recognize that point where it becomes like natural?
I know
not
exactly
think about it.
I know exactly what you're talking about it, but I'm a musician as well, and certainly I played a lot more music when I was younger, and I certainly remember that feeling on a couple of different instruments.
Right.
You know, that moment where you suddenly realize, hang on, I'm not actually thinking in my head. I'm not going A minor, you know, E, whatever. I'm not sure if I've ever quite had that happen with comedy, because I think, and partly, you know, possibly to my detriment. I mean, this goes back to me not wanting to record stuff all the time, is I'm constantly trying to, you know, maybe overthinking it a little bit, maybe trying to think of how it can be different, how it can be better. So yeah, I don't know. I think I definitely had that maybe with stage comedy, with theaters, with improv. I think that maybe happened. But with stand up, maybe not so much. Maybe because I'm probably a little hard on myself in terms of, you know, I am a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to writing, and I don't think I've ever achieved it, you know.
Could be both a blessing and a curse, because
I think it's a drive.
Yeah, because if you're never quite satisfied, or if you don't ever feel like this is natural, you probably work harder to make it as good as you can. Maybe there could be apathy that comes with people who think, you know, I've got this. This is no problems. We can do this.
Dissatisfaction is very much a trait in a lot of things in my life, and it's not necessarily a negative one. It is a driving factor. It is something that keeps me exploring. You know, it is also something that's got me into trouble over the years. You know, it's something that led me places I really shouldn't have gone. But it can be both. It's just a curiosity. It's a desire for perfectionism is probably taking it too far, but just that sense of, I think that's a reason. I mean, again, I'm talking specifically about myself, but there is a reason that you know, a lot of comedians go on forever. You know, we're a bit like blues musicians. You know, there are comedians who, you know, there's a couple of examples I can think of who literally died on stage. You know, they were performing right to the last second. You know, we are in some ways, we're more like those kind of blues musicians who play into their 80s until they physically can't hold the instrument anymore than we are people, you know, comedy actors. A lot of comedy actors retire reasonably young, if you think about it, you know. And you got someone like Gene Wilder, who was an absolute genius and just walked away from the industry, just walked away from it. You don't see that with stand-up quite as much. And I think maybe that's why, is because we constantly think there's still something else to do. There's something new to discover.
And that possibly has, again, a positive and a negative. I mean, some of the last videos of Richard Pryor's last couple of things in video, it's like a shadow of his former self. There should have been a walk away time. But then again, if he had walked away early, you would have missed a whole bunch of his that kind of middle to third life comedy as well.
But you don't even need to do that. I mean, honestly, trust me, go to any open mic gig anywhere in the world and you'll see that person who's been doing comedy for probably 10 years and goes up at and shouldn't. You just should have walked away from it years ago. But there's something that keeps them coming back. You know, and it works at both ends of the scale.
Now you're funny, you're making your first 15 laugh. You remember your first gig, like first stand-up gig, first time in front of a microphone with what, 3 minutes? How was that?
Well, actually, my first one was absolutely unintentional. I was actually directing a version of the capping show at Otago University. It wasn't the capping show. It was a thing called Wombat Television, which was a sort of secondary version of the capping show. And a guy in my cast had decided that he was going to put on a stand-up comedy night at the student bar, the Loaded Goblin, as it was called at the time.
Right.
So I just went along with a few friends to watch. And one of his acts, or more than one of his acts, didn't turn up. So he freaked out because he needed to fill time. And he just kind of looked into the crowd and shouted out the first name he could see, and it was me. So he called me up on stage. And, you know, I'd had a few drinks, and me and a friend had batted some ideas around for kind of jokes at some point earlier that day, I think, you know, with no aim. So I did those. So I remember the circumstances. I couldn't tell you what I talked about.
Right.
Because it wasn't pre-planned, you know. It's
but
not
you
like
must-
I written the list.
But you will remember if it got laughs or not, because that'll stick.
Yeah, we definitely got some. Yeah, it's and you know, part of that was just flying on the seat of your pants, possibly people laughing because they knew how much trouble I was in. But yeah, no, it definitely got laughs, and there was definitely something that happened that made me want to do it again.
Yeah, well, that's the next question. So you get off stage, you get off bar, whatever it was, you're fizzing at the bunghole because you're like, oh my God, the adrenaline's flowing. Then how does that flow into a regular sort of, let's give this a go, let's give this a go, let's give this a go?
Well, I think there's a very common story you'll hear, and I think it's definitely true for me, is that, you know, most of the people I know who, you know, working comedians, their first gig was great, or at least good enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Their second through 10th gigs, not so much.
Right.
and that was my case, because you're trying to catch lightning in a bottle. You know, you're trying to. Yeah. I mean, particularly in my circumstance, I was trying to recapture that, you know, that spontaneity, that completely unexpected, completely unplanned. It was, my improv stuff was obviously kicked in. You know, my ability to be on stage without having any fucking idea what I was actually doing. So then my next attempts at actually writing something that I was going to do and trying to remember didn't go so well. And actually, as it happens, it actually took me years or at least a year to talk myself into opening myself up to improvising again on stage as part of a stand-up routine. You know, because and I think you see this a lot with comedians starting out, is you have this, whatever it is, 2-3 minutes, 3-4 minutes that you've written, and that's what all you've got, and you're stuck with it. And if you get in trouble with it, you're in trouble till you've finished. I mean, you see that with people who have got their first 15 minutes set. You know, they get up there, they start, and if they're struggling in 2 minutes, they're going to struggle for the next 13 minutes because they don't have anywhere else to go. And there's something there. They're actually, I remember very specifically saying to myself in my head, not on stage, I'm not a completely crazy person, but saying in my head, why don't you just stop doing the stuff you've written and wing it, you know? But that took a while. I mean, that took at least a year, if not two, to get to that point.
So do you remember the moment or the age you were at where you kind of went, I'm a stand-up comedian now, like this is my future, this is my job?
That came much later. I mean, I trained as an actor. I did a theater degree at Otago University, and you know, the stand-up was very much. I mean, my kind of regular stand-up gigs were mainly. I was part of a sketch group. We would do a weekly sketch comedy show, and the sketches, just as they do, got more and more elaborate. So eventually, someone had to go on and kill time while people changed costumes or whatever. Right. And that was what passed for my regular stand-up gigs. But it was weekly, and I was writing new stuff for it. But it was only after when I moved to Auckland, I still in my head very much had the idea that I was an actor who did a bit of stand-up. But acting work was very hard to come by up here. And also anything, it was very hard to, it's really hard to pay an immediate bill when you have to rehearse a play for 4 weeks. So I found that I could start doing stand-up gigs at short notice. And if I needed to pay my rent this week, I could probably make a couple of phone calls and get the gigs to do that. And then there was people phoning me, you know, and then I was getting, and then, yeah, it dawned on me. I mean, I don't remember there wasn't a light bulb moment, but yeah, there was a point. There must have been a point where somebody asked me what I did for a living, and instead of saying actor or whatever, I said stand-up comedian.
Nice.
But it was after, it would have been late. So it would have been the late 90s after I moved up to Auckland about 97, I think. So yeah, after that.
All right. When you perform on stage, there seems to be 3 kinds of comedians. Ones who hate hecklers, ones who put up with hecklers, and ones who encourage hecklers. Where do you stand on the trilogy of hecklers? And any good heckling stories to tell us about?
I'd be in the middle. Funnily enough, and I don't have a reason for this, but I can probably count on two hands the number of times I've been properly heckled in my career. You know, for some reason, there's something about my, I don't know, presence on stage, the material I do, there's something about it that just discourages. You know, I can go on stage on a night where every other act has had abuse, has had whatever thrown at them, and for some reason they tend to stop when I go on. No, I don't know why, and it's always been like that. That's not a you know, nothing to do with whether people know who I am or anything else. It's just, I don't know, it's weird. So yeah, I mean, one example of that is I remember going on stage and, you know, it'd been a really rough night and someone yelled something as soon as I got on and I just went after them, you know, started calling them all sorts of names. And then at the end I went, by the way, I didn't even hear what you yelled. What was it? And what he actually yelled was, "Oh, I love you, bro." You know, so, yeah, no. So weirdly, I don't have any particularly great heckle stories because it's for one reason or another, it hasn't happened to me a lot.
It seems that when looking at international acts, Jimmy Carr is the king of hecklers. So much so that, as I said, that 3 tiers, he is one of the examples that encourages it. He gets people to text him messages whilst he's doing his show to respond to, and I like it. I think it's a really interesting dynamic on stage, but I do sometimes think, so you got an hour show and you're going to spend 15 minutes of it responding to the audience. So really you've got a 45-minute show with,
yes. Yeah. But there's a lot more skill. I mean, we call it crowd work, you know, when an MC goes out and just talks to the crowd. But I mean, that's a skill all in itself. You know, some people are superb at it. Other people aren't. I mean, and there are touring comedians again in the UK. I mean, there are touring comedians that's all they do. You know, they don't have material.
Wow.
But I mean, it is a skill in itself, and it's something. It's never something. You know, I've been through phases where I've emceed shows a lot, and I get better at it. I get really good at it, but it's not something I actively go out there looking to do. And my ego's involved. You know, I've got the stuff that I spent time writing. I want people to hear that.
Oh, it's fair though, eh? It's like, I mean, not to harken back to Talkback again, it's like a lot of people don't realize people listen to Talkback for the host. Not even though the show can't happen without the callers, it's the host that people tune in for. So yeah, I can understand that. Okay, a couple for you. We've talked about you growing up. We've talked about when you found out you were funny. What about when you realized you were funny? Were you the kind of kid who ingested comedy? Like, do you have a favorite comedian from when you were growing up? And like through your stages of growing as a comedian, who are some of the comedians you've kind of looked up to or admired from afar, so to speak?
I've never been a total sponge for comedy, but I have watched and listened to a lot of stand-up over the years.
Right.
So, you know, I was hugely influenced, as you know, virtually every comedian of my kind of style and generation was, by Bill Hicks.
Right.
George Carlin was another massive influence on me. You know, I don't sort of remember comedy being something I listened to a lot when I was a kid. Comedy was something I sort of got into when I found myself doing it. You know, by the time when I first started doing stand-up, I really hadn't either watched or listened to an awful lot of stand-up.
Okay.
I mean, partially that's because I was in Dunedin and there wasn't a lot that came through, and you know, we didn't have the streaming services, so you had to kind of go out and find it, you know, and I didn't. But yeah, I mean, yeah, Carlin, Hicks, and then, you know, there's been comics since that I've kind of gravitated to. I mean, Louis C.K. was one, absolutely. You know, I was a huge fan. Richard Pryor, another, and then, you know, I'm a little bit like this with anything I get involved in. You know, I have a tendency to, you know, like I'm a baseball fan, right? I like a sport where you can dive into the history and the statistics and the numbers to the point that, you know, you actually lose track of what made it entertaining to watch. Like you're fascinated by minutiae. So, you know, I'm a student of the history of stand-up, you know, and I love diving into the history and working out who connects with who and all these things, more so than I maybe even watch the end product. So yeah.
So in saying that, what about the next generation? Like, what about those coming up next? Do you look around at the moment as one of the can I say older gentlemen in New Zealand comedy at the moment? Maybe in the middle of the pack when it comes to experience.
Yeah.
Do you look to the next generation? Are there people there who kind of inspire you that you look to and you think, watch out for that one? That one's going to be there's a top-notch one coming.
Yeah, I do. It tends to be, I mean, in brief moments. I don't. Again, I don't watch an awful lot of comedy. So I tend to brush up against the newer generation of comedians when I'm doing a gig with them. If I'm hosting a newer faces night or an open mic or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a real push. I think New Zealand comedy at the moment, one thing that is a little concerning is over the last 10 years, there's suddenly, how do I put this? When I first started doing comedy, particularly in Auckland, I mean, for better or for worse, headlining the Classic Comedy Club on a Friday or Saturday night was pretty much the pinnacle. It was pretty much as far as you could go in comedy here. And, thankfully, that's changed. There's a huge, range of options out there. There is, touring, like we've talked about, television work, podcasts, online specials, all that stuff is coming out. What concerns me a little bit, and I'm talking about I'm talking about the new generation, the people at open mic nights, people that even their friends haven't heard of them yet. I've done a couple of Q&As with people, and there's a lot of people seem to be getting into this business because that's what they want. They want to be on TV, or they want to be famous, or they've got this insane idea that you make good money. That concerns me a little bit. What I really like is what I'm always looking for is someone who's doing comedy because they want to, or without sounding too pretentious about it, because they have to, because there's a drive in them. There's something that makes them, like I say, do this insane thing. I mean, this gets thrown around so much that I'm not, to the point that I'm not even sure if it's true anymore. But people talk about the idea that the one thing people fear more than death is speaking in public. Now, I don't know if that's still true, but it's a good analogy. We do this thing that scares the shit out of people. Plus, you add this idea of having to make people laugh. And if you're not getting into it because you want to do that and have to do that, if you want to be on TV, apply for a reality television show. If you want a podcast, do a podcast. If you want to make money, my God, do anything else. But yeah, so I'm both a little inspired and a little wary about the new generation, and I'm talking about the really new generation. I mean, there are comedians literally half my age who are doing great work. Who I work with all the time, and who you'll see on TV and various other things, and they're doing phenomenal work.
All right, last question, Jeremy. 2023, what does it hold for you, especially when it comes to the craft of comedy?
It's a really good question. I don't know. 2022 was very much a rebuilding year. I mean, 2020, 2021, the COVID years, and I don't want to step on the toes of your other projects, but we've talked about this. That's not over. But 2022 was very much a rebuilding year. It was very much a year of a lot of my gigs, particularly in the first few months of last year, were catching up on gigs that had been postponed from the couple of previous years. And then there was just a phase of just getting back into performing regularly, after this enforced 2-year break, which I thoroughly enjoyed, by the way. I enjoyed taking all of the other stuff aside. I quite enjoyed having a break from performing regularly, for performing as it has become my job, and there are some days where it really does feel like a job. It feels like I'm going to work, and so this year I don't have much planned as yet. I'm going to do a bit more stuff in Australia, which I haven't done for years. This is all, works in progress, but I've got some gigs booked in Australia. I'm looking at maybe going back and doing some more stuff in Canada a bit later in the year. But yeah, my eyes are kind of, I can keep doing this the way I've been doing it and doing fine, making a living, all of that stuff. But I've got my eyes open a little bit for other things, other ways that I can work it. I'd like to do a lot more writing this year, both for stand-up and for other things. But yeah, watch this space is the simple answer to that question.
And I guess even though you've said others describe you as a political comedian, there is an election this year in New Zealand, and I'm sure that there'll be written and or on stage content coming from you to do with that, because even though you're kind of distancing yourself from accepting that label, you do gravitate towards it, don't you?
Well, like I say, I gravitate towards things that annoy me. And politics is good for that. And I guess that's why maybe I've gravitated slightly away from politics in recent years, is partially because either things have been, the focus has been on other things, for the last, COVID, what has been the focus? It's been the buzzword,
So what I hear you saying is a vote for national is a vote for the return of political comedy. Is that what I'm hearing? I think am I wrong?
You're getting that way. Yeah. But also we'll just sort of see how the whole thing pans out. It's going to be, it's going to be on my radar a bit more this year than it has been for a couple of years. So yeah, there'll be stuff.
Jeremy Elwood, stand-up comedian. Where can people come and find you if they want to find out more about what you are up to?
Well, I'm on the socials, and Jeremy Elwood. I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. There's a little bit, like I say, not a lot of my stuff online. JeremyElwood.com will just give you some upcoming dates and so on. But otherwise, yeah, just watch this space. I do plan on getting out and touring a bit more this year. So yeah, keep an eye on all that stuff, and I'll announce it when I have the details.
All right, Kaz. Thanks for joining us today.
No problem, man.